So on November 3rd, 2022, Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada and Minister of Finance, issued the annual fall economic statement. As usual, the statement contained an overview of the Canadian economy and announced the Liberal government's various plans for its improvement. And more surprisingly, the fall economic statement, or the FES, called out the Canadian trucking industry for, quote, misleading drivers Inc. practice, which misclassify for the misleading drivers Inc. Practice, which misclassifies employee drivers as independent contractors. And it announced that the government would spend $26.3 million over 5 years, starting in 2023 24, to take stronger action to curb this deceptive practice. The labor program of ESDC, which enforces federal employment standards, would receive these funds, and labor inspectors would be expected to crack down on the misclassification of interprovincial truck drivers across the country. It is difficult to recall another occasion when a federal minister, other than perhaps a minister of labor, called out a particular industry for violating workers' rights in such a high-level document and promised to provide funding to strengthen enforcement. So the goal of our paper is to explain what brought us to this moment. To do so in our presentation, I'll briefly describe the research project, a study of labor standards and their enforcement in the federally regulated private sector, or the FRPS, of which our paper is a part. Next, I'll define the FRPS for those who are perhaps not so familiar with it and the key features of its workforce. And then against this backdrop, our efforts to try to document and profile employment rights violations in this federally regulated road transportation sector using qualitative and quantitative data. And then Andy will provide a statistical profile of labor standards violations in trucking in that industry. And then Adam will offer our structural explanation for the large volume of trucking labor standards violations, exploring why labor rights violations have yet to be adequately addressed through the enforcement of existing labor standards, and attending to several major compliance challenges that we have encountered that are rooted very much in the government's compliance-oriented enforcement strategy, we argue. And then we'll end by exploring how and why. Yeah, hold the mic. I wondered. That's why. I'm a little too tall to stand up and a little too short to sit down. So there you go. We'll talk a little bit about our methods first, and we'll end by talking about the lack of initially the lack of, I guess, political will around this question and how it changed in a particular period. Okay, so to begin with a bit of a brief note on our methods. So our paper is based on a mixed method approach involving quantitative and qualitative data analysis, neither of which would have been possible without the support and a very important research agreement that we engaged in with ESDC's labor program. And we did so at a time when, and this is a treat for us to have Anthony chairing this panel. We had no idea until just a few days ago that he would be here, when Anthony was very much involved with the labor program and helped us over many years to get access to certain kinds of administrative data that make this analysis possible. And we subsequently, so thank you very much. We subsequently interviewed 23 labor inspectors in the federal labor program across the country for their views about what was going on. Our focus is not trucking, but trucking very much emerged in the analysis of transport as being very pertinent. So where the quantitative data are concerned, we rely on administrative data derived from the federal labor program's LA2K, or Labor Application 2000 database, which tracks enforcement activities of its labor inspectorate. The LA2K contains information on all enforcement and investigative work assigned to labor program employees, as well as case outcomes. Some data are entered by complainants using an online complaints portal, whereas other information is entered by staff during the life cycle of a complaint. And it's, of course, designed as a task management and tracking system. And for that reason, academic researchers haven't had much access to it. So we were very fortunate to gain access. And as I mentioned, we interviewed 23 staff people from the labor program. So shifting now to the federally regulated private sector and a brief description of it, and this very much the significance of trucking in this domain. So briefly, the FRPS is comprised of industries and sectors that cut across provincial and territorial jurisdiction, such as telecommunications and banking, postal, shipping, and primary resource sectors such as mining, as well as interprovincial rail, air, and transport, and also some First Nations activities, which is another part of the project that we've been working on. So broadly speaking, labor standards in the FRPS, as far as paper rights are concerned, are in many cases more robust than those in the provincially regulated private sectors across the country. They've also largely been subject to fewer enforcement challenges due largely to the historical presence of large firms and long tenure, historically largely white male workers in large industries, large firms. In other words, the FRPS has historically been a site of good jobs, specifically a standard employment relationship, especially for white male citizen workers. However, in recent years, fueled by deunionization, coupled with neoliberal deregulation, which of course is tied and intimately related to fissuring, and the rise of SMEs, trucking has become something of an outlier to the otherwise relatively better, albeit eroding employment in the federally regulated public sector, which we've written about. And now Andy's going to tell you a little bit more about that process.
Great, thank you. So broadly speaking, over the period from 2006 to 2018, the trucking sector has consistently accounted for 70 to 80% of founded labor standards violations identified via worker complaints. And that is hugely disproportionate to the actual size of the industry. 17 to 19% of federally regulated private sector workers are in trucking. So it's just way out of proportion. And although the share of violations has generally increased over time, this increase is particularly pronounced in 2015 and onwards. So compared to other sectors, labor standards violations in the trucking industry are overwhelmingly monetary in nature, particularly violations related to regular pay, vacation pay, and holiday pay. And the prevalence of violations related to unpaid wages is particularly notable because you can't just say, oh, I didn't know I had to pay wages, unlike some of the other statutory entitlements. And in our interviews with labor affairs officers, several reported complex and non-standard payment schemes, which made it very difficult to track wage violations. So instead of hourly wages, truckers reported being paid by the load or by the mile, which makes these claims particularly challenging to adjudicate. The only monetary violation that's actually less prominent in trucking than other industries are those related to overtime pay, because truckers have different overtime pay thresholds than other industries. There's also a bit more in terms of illegal deductions in trucking. So not only are there more labor standards violations in trucking, employers in trucking are found to be in violation and are much less likely to comply at an early stage of the process compared to other industries. So as this graph shows, trucking violations are most likely to escalate to payment orders, the most serious form of intervention available to labor program staff. These additional stages of intervention mean that workers wait much longer to have violations rectified, and they may actually have no restitution at all. The recalcitrance of trucking employers to comply with LAO assessments serves as an additional deterrent to filing a complaint. It's quite possible it will take a very long time, and nothing will come of it if you do. Underscoring the effect of vertical disintegration in the trucking industry, violations in trucking are also overwhelmingly concentrated among small firms of less than 20 employees. So in general, small firms are more likely to account for labor violations than larger firms. Almost 2/3 of violations in the trucking industry relate to small firms, reflecting the proliferation of small enterprises in the sector overall. As well, the smaller the firm, the less likely you are to comply at an early stage of intervention. So among the smallest firms, more than half go to requiring a payment order. So to review, trucking stands out among the federally regulated industries for its share of labor violations. The violations are overwhelmingly monetary in nature, and because they require lots of intervention, they take a really long time for complaints to be resolved. So Adam's now going to talk about how we got there. We are going to.
Probably wing it, but I shouldn't. Okay, so additionally, our paper tries to offer a structural explanation for how we got to this situation. And so we engage in what we call a political economy of trucking violations. And we start by trying to essentially talk about the economic and regulatory environment in the trucking sector and track it over time. So trucking was once a highly unionized or a fairly highly unionized sector and relatively well regulated. But following trends in the United States, the Canadian trucking sector was deregulated beginning in the 80s, and which led to a fall in unionization and a commensurate rise in the share of self-employed drivers and small for-hire firms and various forms of precarious employment. So what we call the regulated era, this era of higher unionization and more regulation, essentially what you had is a kind of strong price setting power by the larger firms that dominated the sector, which were largely unionized by the Teamsters. And you had even a sort of system of centralized bargaining, essentially, especially in Ontario and Quebec, which covered a lot of those firms. And so by no means universal, this multi-employer bargaining system allowed unions, particularly the Teamsters, to negotiate wages and benefits that covered a large portion of that for-hire trucking sector, and essentially was able to capture a portion of the rents that were generated there. It wasn't the most economically efficient in terms of its market pricing, but it allowed unions to capture a share of those economic rents. It also created barriers to entry and a sort of centralized system of price setting that made it difficult for small firms to access the market. And so this was largely undermined through the deregulatory process later on. But despite that regulatory environment, there was still this problem of long working hours. And that's something that persists now, and in some ways is probably exacerbated by this growth of small firms and precarious forms of employment, particularly around independent owner operators, which we gestured at in the beginning around the government's recognition that misclassification has become this persistent problem. So then we track what we call the deregulated or the market-driven era. And here we have two graphs covering the decline in union coverage on the one hand, and then the growth in self-employment on the other hand, which the two kind of mirror one another, unsurprisingly. So quickly, the Canadian government deregulated the trucking sector via the Motor Vehicle Transport Act of '87, and then the provinces followed suit. And as I mentioned, this was because of competitive pressure from the states. The US had deregulated the industry earlier, and American firms were essentially out-competing Canadian firms, so there was structural pressure to engage in this. And so between '97 and 2020, collective bargaining coverage fell from 17 to 11%, and self-employment, as I mentioned, has increased. Along with this, a growing number of racialized workers are employed in trucking, and there's been an increased use of the temporary foreign worker program and the international mobility program. This is a sort of feature of this move towards precarious employment that we're still sort of examining here. And while average firm size has grown somewhat in the deregulated era, it masks this considerable growth in independent contracting and fissuring in the workforce. And a lot of times what you're seeing is that larger firms are contracting these smaller owner operators and small for-hire firms. So it's contributed the deregulation to the creation of an economic and regulatory environment that's conducive to this type of labor standard violation, as we mentioned. So I'll just try to quickly wrap up. So the regulated era sustained a protective labor regime for largely unionized truckers with a share of monopoly rents captured by workers, we argue. Deregulation undermined this arrangement and eroded union coverage and essentially fissured the trucking workforce. And now you have this additional problem of racialization and a growing use of temporary foreign workers that's coincided with this undermining truckers' working conditions.